Hi students, welcome to the environment module and the persuasion part today. Today I would like to talk to you about persuasion, the process aimed at changing a person's attitude or behavior, whatever, um, without using power, so to speak. So power would be the idea, I have something that you want, and because of that I can make you do something. And persuasion, on the other hand, is, using tricks and shortcuts to get people to do what you want them to do. And there's, for those of you who already did the readings, there's several principles underlying persuasion. How can you get people to do what you want them to do? Or how do other people get you to do what they want to do, right? And those principles are represented here on the right-hand side. Default, scarcity, reciprocity, attention, messenger, commitments, priming, and social proof. And today I want to talk about all of them a little bit, like 2-3 slides maximum. And I want to share a little bit of the scientific backing of those. I will not talk about priming too much. It's too much cognitive psychology. But if you think back to the first lecture that we had with the example of the lamp and the piece of furniture that looked like a woman's, spread legs as compared to, a lamp, which was quite obvious when I put the IKEA logo in there. That's how, thinking works. We think in schema. When I talk about a cat, suddenly you think about dogs. Those kind of idea. For those of you that are interested, just do some Googling on priming. Cool stuff, but I'm not going to go into detail on that. But the other ones I'm going to cover a little bit. My goal is to be done with this slide in, let's say, 15-20 minutes, but let's see if I can manage. I shared with you this slide at the end of a class, a YouTube tutorial, and I asked you what you think of it, and then I didn't get back at it in the class, so that's my bad. And now I'm going to reveal that. So have a look at it for those of you that haven't seen it before. Think what it is. I'm going to have a sip of coffee, finish this, and then we can talk about it. So this is from a paper by Johnson and Goldstein from 2003, if I remember correctly. And basically what it shows, and it's out of date because the Netherlands are also close to the 100% mark now. What it shows is organ donation rates in countries across Europe. They're all in Europe. And it's quite, puzzling initially to see that some countries, most of the people when they die or have an accident or an injury or whatever, are willing to give their organs. And in some countries such as Germany, the United Kingdom, well, not Netherlands anymore, they don't. And Germany and Austria, for instance, are, they're culturally very similar. So the question arises, why do, Austrians give their organs and Germans don't? And the answer lies in a bias called the default bias. And I think firstly here, before we zoom into the default bias, the idea is that we talked about cognitive biases and heuristics initially, right? And think of them as the underlying of persuasion. So for instance, if you want people to behave in a certain way, in brackets, give their organs when they die, make it a default. Because the default, tends to have this strong looming all present effect. People are, I don't want to say all people are, but a lot of people are very lazy, and they just go with, the status quo, which is the default. So to give you an example, telecommunication industry was like a monopoly in most of the states and most of the countries in Europe, including in Germany, where I'm from. And then the government decided to break the monopoly and allow other players to enter the market. But initially, in the first couple of years, like no one moved away from telecom, which was the dominant company, right, the incumbent company. And the reason for it was more or less that people were just too lazy to change their contracts, although they could save up to 40%. I think that's what it was initially. But the default has this massive, impact on people. And in the case of organ donations, that's very sad because it's extremely important that people give their organs, at least in my opinion, right? It might literally save lives, but just because people are lazy, they don't, right? And apply it on startups, that's the tricky part you got to keep in mind, right? Because if you come up with an idea, if you have a new product that hasn't been, in the market before and no one knows what it is, it's like the default for most people is no, I don't need anything, I don't want anything. So you have to convince them, or you have to shift the default if you then can. And this relates to bias called opt-in and opt-out bias. You've all seen this in like email newsletters and stuff. It's like you can literally, be unethical here and mislead people with this kind of bias. Just keep it in mind. Okay, moving on to a principle that I think we can only, we can spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes on, and then everyone knows what this is, and everyone encounters this principle on a daily basis, very, very often. So whenever you browse the internet for product, most websites have like one or the other options. Like on the left, there's this deal where they anchor you, pretty straightforward. Anchoring bias, very easily applicable in the realm of scarcity. Or they give you like something, they give you this illusion of scarcity. It's like, oh look, I want to sell my motorbike here on the right hand side, but we only have so many motorbikes and like 12% of claims already. There's a time ticking. So if you book a flight, for instance, what usually happens is they tell you, you only have 12 minutes for this offer remaining, yada yada yada. It's like, spoiler alert, you have as much time as you want to, or they, extend the offer, or you just open another website and you maybe even get a better offer. So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind how cookies work, right? It's like that's not necessarily the scarcity, but maybe just on an anecdote here, if you would say use a VPN and enter, the airline website from Spain, you would probably pay less just because the wage average is a little lower in Spain than here, right? So use a VPN if you book a flight. Also, always use incognito or remove your cookies afterwards, because if you go looking for the same flight repeatedly, the algorithm learns that you're really interested and gives you a higher price. Also, if you use a MacBook, for instance, instead of a Windows computer, MacBooks tend to be a little more pricey. So market researchers have found that, hey, you know what? People with MacBooks, they like to spoil themselves. Let's give them, more pricier hotel offers in combination with those flights. Keep those things in mind. But the general idea about scarcity here is that, we value things that are scarce, evolutionary speaking, for instance, food. It's like keeps us alive. Scarce things are running out. Like an alarm goes up in our head, we go for it. And the more scarce, the more, the more pricey, the more we want it, and vice versa, right? So it's very common. You see the supply and demand chart here on the left hand side. I don't think I need to zoom in on this. Very straightforward. There is goods to which the basic economic principle, keep that in mind too, doesn't apply. They're called superior goods. So here the idea is, like, for instance, a Rolex watch, right? The pricier it is, the higher the demand is as well, because it brings in status and those kind of considerations. But for the majority of goods and for the majority of applications, scarcity just means we want stuff that's scarce, so we go for it. And the scarcer things are, the more we value them. So the science behind it here, like Giardini and Rhodes, what they literally did, they just offered cookies to participants, and either the cookies were in a jar where there was only 2 cookies left, or they were in a jar where 10 cookies were left. And then they asked people how much, they enjoyed eating the cookie, and how much they evaluated the cookie, and how much they would be willing to pay for a cookie. And in the jar where the cookies were, limited, where there were only 2 cookies, all 3 measures, people wanted to pay more, eat more, enjoyed the cookie more. Right? Pretty straightforward. Next one. This one is pretty cool and pretty impactful in my opinion. And from a sociological standpoint, it's also, it's all present, it's omnipresent, it's like a very powerful principle of persuasion. It's called reciprocity. So it's this idea that it's like, you could almost say it's like this glue, this golden rule, what keeps societies rolling. So right, you're nice to someone, and this someone is nice back to you, right? If you walk the street and you smile at someone, woman, man, whatever, they tend to smile back, and vice versa, right? If someone smiles at you. So this is this idea, and this also is applied in, in marketing products. It's applied in selling stuff. It's applied even in research, which is kind of scary for me. So the paper that I linked here, for those of you that are really interested, it's by Stelfox and colleagues. And what they found is they looked at people, at researchers, and their articles on beta channel blockers, which are like presented here on the drugs that I picture. There are a picture here, which is a life-saving medication for people with high blood pressure. And they looked if researchers either wrote, security concerning articles. So they said like, oh, those drugs are dangerous and careful, we should watch out. Or if they supported, the pharma companies' claims that they're good. And 100% of people that said the drugs are, safe and they should be used, have had or have received, some sort of, it's American studies, have received some sort of benefit from those companies, like whatever they get. It's a different medical system, right? From a pen to like a trip, a sponsor trip, those kind of things, or conference fee paid, you name it. Whereas 37% of people that didn't receive any funding wrote, only 37% of people that didn't receive any funding wrote that those drugs are harmless. So you can see here how this might have even biased researchers, who actually should always look for the truth and not for any, desirable outcome, not any confirmation bias whatsoever. And the oldest study here, all those psychological studies that research those kind of principles, and also the biases that are rooted in. I'll get to that in the next lecture, actually. Go back to the 60s, and what they did is they They just wanted people to sign a petition for veterans, and they sent out letters. It's like, hey, can you send this petition, and can you send the letter back? And in some of the letters, they put little tags, just like a little sign that you could put on your belt with your name on it. So they looked up the people they sent the letter to, and then they included like a little, like a tag you could put on your bell, so you could label your bell, so to speak. And the numbers that sent those letters back, and those are like cold call numbers, right? They're like in the 32% when there was a label in it, and they were only 10% when there was no label in it, right? Because you received this label, you feel appreciated, you think, oh, that's nice. Let me do something nice in return, and send this letter back and sign the petition, which is what they wanted. This one is actually biased, and I use it to explain this phenomenon of attention. So of course we always talk about humans, right? And this was also actually like on a personal anecdote. This was the reason why I did a master's in psychology after I did a master's in economics, because we're not machines, right? So in business and economics, you've heard this term of like homo economicus, right? Which is a cool model, to represent the real world, but it's not how the real world works. So, and in the real world, we're not perfectly functioning rational machines. We're actually humans, and we are limited by, our senses, for instance, our memory capacity, for instance. And this bias here is basically related in the primacy and recency effect. So this idea that if I would give you a list of objects or names, right? Let's say 10, most people can remember up to 7. Let's say 10 or 15, and I would ask you to recall them, you'd be pretty accurate in recalling the first 3, 4 names that I shared with you. And you would also be pretty accurate, that's the primacy effect, you'd also be pretty accurate in recalling the last 3 or 4 names that I shared with you. And in the middle, it's all a little bit wishy-washy, right? And so that means for you, if you want to persuade someone, right? Use your key arguments or your key selling points, right, either right at the beginning or right at the end, because there they have, relatively speaking, more impact. And there's a cool study that shows that by Wendy de Bruin, or something like that. I hope I pronounced it correctly for the Dutchies among you. And she just looked at your outcome in events such as the Eurovision Song Contest or like ice skating events that are like usually based on a jury decision in relation to where you were positioned in that event. So where do you start? And people that are the later in that event, they tend to do way better. And the idea here was actually, and you could statistically control for effects that like better people tend to be at the end. And even when you control for this effect, like there's a recency effect in your outcome. So persuasiveness is higher, the later you are towards the end of events. So I think that's pretty cool. The next one, liking principle, for those of you who did the readings, they used the Cialdini reading, Cialdini 2001. They used the example of Tupperware parties. So it's better to sell Tupperware if you have a host that's a local host that's known to all the other people, just because people like this host and therefore this host is more persuasive. And generally speaking, people are more easily persuaded by others whom they like. It makes sense if there is someone I hate, I hate this person's gut. Of course, I have this like natural, curiosity or like negative curiosity. I'm a little bit hesitant in believing this person, but if I like him, I'm more prone to believing. That's why I use Shia LaBeouf here. He's not, sponsored by Nike whatsoever. I just think he's a fucking cool actor, so I put him in here. And friends are stronger persuaders. So that's this whole idea. That's also the idea why big companies drop their advertising models instantly as soon as they screw up in their private lives, because it might impair with this liking principle. And how do you get people to like you? So of course, there's a bunch of ways, but for you, the 2 things that seem to be the most easily achieved are similarity. So if you have something in common, it's more likely that other people like you, right? So stress similarity. And the other one is praise. So make compliments that appear what they are or are genuine. Otherwise, this might backfire too. So that's the liking principle. Another one, like liking, obviously relates to the bigger principle of the messenger, right? The other one that's pretty straightforward is called the authority bias, and it's like from since we're little, basically we learn to obey our parents, obey our elders, obey the police, obey experts, and people defer to the opinion of experts to quite an extent. So I'm gonna show you something after the slide. But it's like authority is the power or right, and it may not be legitimate. It's just perceived, right? to give orders and enforce obedience. So that's why I have like the Pokemon, indexes or orders or whatever they're called here. If you have credentials, right, diplomas, certificates, whatever, make sure if you want to sell something, for instance, or if you want to, if you want people to follow your authority, to make sure to establish your authority. So the study here that cited, actually they looked at physiotherapists actually. And physiotherapists are like, they're really important, especially after they have had injuries, right? And they tell people what they have to do, what kind of exercise program and routine they have to follow at home. The same right now, we're all working out at home, but are we good at it or are we slacking? And the research shows that if those physiotherapists were actually showing their certificates, and the more certificates, the better, in their offices when they gave the instructions, people were more likely to follow those instructions, subconsciously speaking. They didn't like point out like, look, I have all the certificates in the back. Just by putting them there, making them visible to the audience was more likely to follow. And I'm not going to talk about this much. This is a real life application of the authority principle. It's called the Milgram studies. It's one of the most highly cited and highly well spread and well-known phenomenon in psychology. Basically, researchers tried to find out how willing are people to defer to authority. And they were curious in the 60s after World War II because they wanted to investigate if the Germans are just an evil people or if normal people are capable of doing atrocities and doing horrendous things. And I'm gonna share a link to a YouTube video that shows that. I'm not gonna like make links pop up now, but for those of you that are interested, look in the footnotes. I'll put a link there that gets you to like a very short video on Milgram studies. It's maybe not particularly relevant for this course. It's just an application of the authority bias, but it's definitely basic knowledge, and it's cool if you've seen it at least once and heard about it. The next one is really, really cool, actually. It's called the commitment and consistency principle. And the idea here is that, so picture you are a restaurant owner, right? And the Netherlands is pretty cool. Last year there was a debate about because restaurants started charging people for not showing up. So basically, when you make a reservation with your credit card, they deduct $10, and if you then show up, you pay $10 less for your meal. So it evens out. But if you don't show up, those $10 are gone. It was a massive, like public debate even. I remember the Parole article. Because the idea is that if you own a restaurant, people that say they want to show up but then don't, so-called no-shows, right, have a massive economic impact on your business. And the no-show rates in higher end, higher tier restaurants tend to be around the 30%, which is actually quite a lot if you think about it. And again, those are studies in the United States. Maybe it's a little less here. Maybe we're more reliable as Europeans. Who knows, right? But there's still a lot of people, and we've all, committed this. It's not a crime, but committed this, this act of being, unreliable. It's a massive economic burden. So researchers try to find a way to get this number to a lower number, and they managed to reduce the no-show rate of 30% to 10% by just changing the question that waiters ask on the telephone when you make a reservation. So first it was like, please call if you have to change your plans, and then they changed it to, so you make your reservation and the waiter's like, oh nice, I wrote it all down, thanks Kai for showing up, I'll see you, Tuesday at 7, awesome. But one more thing, will you please call if you have to change your plans? And then they would wait. And people can't really deal with like, this awkwardness of silence, so they wait. That's like, what's happening? It's like, yeah, I'll call, or yes, and then you hang up. And the idea is by just saying yes or yeah, I'll call, you kind of commit. And people have this like innate desire to be consistent with what they, say they're going to do, right? There's also one of those things that makes societies work, because if I can consistently not rely on others doing what they say they're doing, being chronic liars whatsoever, I'll eventually end contact with them, right? Because they're unreliable, and I need, my friends to be people I can trust in and I can work with, and I can't work with those kind of people. So we learned over time that it's better to be consistent, be consistently doing what we're promised to do. So people would call, or people would actually show up, and no show rate declined. So this is this like principle of commitment and consistency. And it's so the studies here also from the 60s, they go back to Basically, you want people to, let's say, donate to your cause, right? And what you do is like instead of just knocking on the door and like asking, hey, can you donate? I want to build a recreational center for the elderly so they can do sports. That's what they did in that study. They would go there and just have you sign a petition. Like before they ask you for money, what they do is they just have you sign a petition 2 weeks in advance, right? It's this idea like, hey, do you agree that taking care of the elderly and that they move and stuff is an important public measure? Do you Could we have your signature? And people are like, yeah, fuck it, it's my signature. I'm just gonna sign this whatsoever. And then 2 weeks later, they knock again, or a different team knocks. It's like, would you mind financially contributing to a center of the elderly that is supposed to be built here? And then people that signed in, 62%, I think that was the number of people that signed this petition, ended up actually, financially contributing to the petition. Whereas people that didn't, sign the petition were significantly less likely to contribute. So this idea of commitment and consistency. People desire to be internally consistent in their behavior and value consistency in others. And there's a cool quote by the guy on the right is Da Vinci, obviously, Leonardo. It's easier to resist at the beginning than at the end. And for those of you that want to think of an application, think of actually what's in the 80s. It's a Schwarzwald study that I see here, not 60s. Think of an application. It's like we've all walked around, the city center, and then there's people want us to sign something or want us to give to whatever cause it may be. And the moment you stop, you've kind of already lost, right? Because then you go, I've stopped, I've shown my interest, and now I'm like also following this norm of like being nice in a conversation. I can't really get out, and then you end up giving actually something, That's an application of commitment and consistency. So basically, if you don't want to give, just say, thank you, sorry, no time whatsoever, but just keep walking. That's the idea how you get out of the situations. Or you can also contribute. Like some of the courses are really good. I'm not saying don't give, right? I'm just saying the moment you stop, you also subconsciously signal to yourself, I'm stopping. Maybe I actually, feel obliged to give now. So be careful, watch out there. And another thing that's also, obviously pretty big. It's like I'm a big fan of Kendrick Lamar. That's why I put like a picture here and a little bit of his one of his songs is like, got the blunt in my mouth. Usually I'm drug free, but shit, I'm with the homies, right? Of course, we are influenced by the people around us. So the idea, the principle of social proof and of peer pressure, like they're related, they're not identical, obviously. So if you find yourself smoking, and I'm not talking about drugs, entirely up to you. I'm super open about those things. You are more likely to find yourself smoking if your friends are smoking. This is the general idea of like peer pressure, right? Social influence, so to speak. And social proof, very related, is this idea that especially in situations where you don't know what to do, you are likely to orient your behavior towards what your friends are doing or what other people around you are doing. And the more ambiguous the situation, the stronger is this effect. And those kind of things tend to backfire quite a lot because people don't understand what they're doing when they, require people to do certain things. So for instance, in the blue box in the middle of the screen, you can see a message, a real life message applied in a national park in the United States. I think it actually was Yellowstone. And what happens is like, there's certain objects that fall to the floor and they petrify. So let's not talk about the techniques of petrification, but basically they last forever and they look pretty cool. And people tend to steal them. They take them away out of the natural habitat to like as a token, put them in their apartments because they look nice whatsoever. And obviously the park doesn't want that because they're part of the ecosystem and like some animals, like they don't feed them, but like it's part of the ecosystem and they want it to remain at the park. So they put the sign up saying many past visitors have removed the petrified wood from the park, destroying the natural state of the petrified forest. Please don't do that. And actually, they noticed afterwards that even more objects were gone now, and they couldn't find out why till they brought in a bunch of psychologists who said, like, look, what this message actually conveys is that a lot of people are already doing it, so it's kind of okay if I do it too. So people were more likely to actually take things as well. So take that in mind. And this is a study from also Milgram. Another of the studies, like one of the most influential psychologists that's out there or has been out there actually. From the late 60s, and what they just did is they had people in New York, busy street of New York, they had people just stand and look upwards. And when there's like just one person standing and looking up a skyscraper, no one stops. Like 4% of people just stop. They think like he's an idiot. However, when there's 5 people just staring up a skyscraper, and it's New York, right? It's people, it's Russia, or people walking past, and people in New York care less than they do here. There's also signs on that, right? 1 in 5 persons would stop. And if there's 15 people looking upwards, like almost half of the people that walk past stop and look and try to figure out what's going on. Humans are herd animals. They orient their behavior towards others, especially if they have no idea what's going on. All right, I'm speaking a little bit fast today because my headphones signaled to me 50 minutes ago that they're running out of battery. So I hope to make it before this ends. But we talked about defaults, right? Organ donation, very, very powerful. We talked about scarcity, things that are scarce are valuable. Talked about reciprocity, be nice, receive something nice in return. Especially relevant if you have a startup and you have a product that's very new and you cannot really put a price on it. Sometimes it makes sense to just give away stuff for free. Oftentimes it doesn't. Just keep it in mind. Attention, we're not perfectly functioning robots. We're limited, and therefore we are also influenceable. Or can be influenced. The the messenger matters too, right? Is it a friend? Do we like this person? Does this person have authority? Do we have authority, etc., etc.? People tend to be or like to be consistent with their behaviors, right? So if you can establish like this habit of saying yes, for instance, you'll get what you want from them. Primary, not so much. Social proof. We do what we think everyone else does, right? If everyone walks around with an iPhone, we might get an iPhone too. So that was very fastly spoken, the idea of those like 6, 7, 8 principles of persuasion. Those of you interested, have a look at the Cialdini paper I shared. Very short, very straightforward. It's a Harvard Business Review article. It's not too scientifically written. Nice read, basic knowledge, cool stuff. Go for it. I'll see you in the next slide lecture on principles underlying, theory and principles, theory underlying those principles, excuse me. So just click on the next video if you're interested or have a break. And I'll see you on Wednesday in class. So take care till then, guys and girls.